Tadej Pogačar and Jonas Vingegaard are the two hot favourites for the 2024 Tour de France, but who has the better bike? In this video we're going to walk you through each of their setups and see how they compare. But before we get onto that, a big thanks to Motul for sponsoring this part of the video. Let's get onto the bikes. Right, so here we have Tadej Pogačar's Colnago V4 RS. So this is his number 5 bike, it's not his primary bike, and so I think there are a few differences on this compared to the one he'll actually race. Obviously we saw his bike last year at the 2023 Tour de France, also had a few things. Broadly overall it's similar, but there are just a couple of details that I think his race bike are going to have that this one won't, but we'll walk you through those. So the V4 RS is Colnago's lightweight all-round aero road platform, replaced the V3 RS a few years ago. It's got a claimed weight of 798 grams in a size 485, which is kind of roughly equivalent to a size 53 from other brands. That pairs with a 375 gram fork for a fairly lightweight platform overall. It's claimed to be around 13.2 watts more aero than the V3 RS that it replaced, and last year when we weighed Tadej Pogačar's bike at the 2023 Tour de France, his bike weighed 7.245 kilos overall, so be interesting to see how much this one weighs. We'll show you in a bit. In terms of finishing kit, Tadej has the NV SES 4.5 wheels, which are kind of a 40mm deep rim at the front paired with a 50mm deep rim at the rear. They're very, very wide, and on these Tadej Pogačar's got some GP 5000 STR tyres that look really, really massive, so we'll measure those. Last year his tyres were measuring around 30mm, 31mm at the back, but these look even bigger. Like, these are definitely the biggest tyres we've seen so far. What's kind of interesting is that these are the STR tyres, the kind of standard all-round version. Last year when we saw Pogačar's, I think, number 2 bike, it had the TTTR tyres, which are the lighter time trial specific version. And I would imagine that we're going to see Tadej race on the lighter tyres quite often throughout this year's race. Up here he also has an NV one-piece integrated cockpit, which was new at last year's Tour and was designed with input from Pogačar himself. Obviously he has his Dura Ace shifters. They're a little bit tilted in, but not to the kind of extreme that we used to see before the kind of UCI brought in a rule around that. But he does have little sprint shifters just on the inside of each drop, just so he can shift whilst he sprints. One other change with the frame set is that the paint job has been subtly updated for this year. Last year there was a little bit less colour, but we've got the kind of UAE colours up here, a little bit of extra detail just around the head tube and the fork and stuff like that. Looks quite cool. It's still a matte black paint job overall, which I assume is just there to kind of keep things lightweight, because obviously adding lots of different layers of paint and colour adds significant weight. On this bike he's got a standard Colnago seat post. Again, like on last year's bike, it had a kind of unbranded Derimo seat post, which is a super light post from a Spanish brand. But this bike does have the kind of fancy carbon tie stuff. So we've got these incredibly bling carbon tie chain rings, which are a kind of like titanium chain ring, you know, made stiffer with a little bit of carbon fibre. And the same with the brake rotors here. These carbon tie brake rotors have a carbon carrier with a really like drilled out brake rotor surface. So just a kind of like ultra light, high performing, high cost option. One other interesting detail with the brakes is we've got these absolute black brake pads. Now in their kind of customary style, Absolute Black claims that these are the best brake pads in the world. The distinctive feature of these brake pads is the really large cooling fins that are kind of, you know, Shimano standard brake pads have similar cooling fins, but instead of kind of coming out horizontally, these ones go back a little bit further. Absolute Black also claims that the kind of brake pads and the backing of the brake pads is infused with graphene, which helps with heat dissipation and also offers like a really extended lifespan. You know, obviously I've not used these, so maybe it's true, but Absolute Black is claiming that these last for around 8,000 kilometers, even in hilly terrain. So, you know, they're kind of 50 euros a set, but if they last 8,000 K, then I guess that's not bad. Now in terms of drivetrain, Tadej Pogačar's running the 54 40-tooth chain rings up front, paired with a wide-ranging 11 to 34-tooth cassette out back. Now on some of the other UAE team bikes, we have seen some of the guys using kind of red anodized direct mount hangers for their rear derailleurs, which just kind of like, you get rid of this little extra knuckle here and it just stiffens up the shifting and makes the rear wheel a little bit easier to remove. So obviously in the event of a puncture, that might save a few seconds if they can get the rear wheel out a little bit quicker and put a new one in. In terms of finishing kit, this year Pogačar is using a Pro Logo Nagel R4 saddle, which is slightly different to last year. Last year when we saw his bike, he had a custom saddle with kind of custom graphics donating some of his achievements. So again, like, you know, maybe he only has those on his kind of like number 1 and number 2 race bike. and then he's using Dura-Ace pedals, which, as we always say, very popular option, as well as Elite Ligaro carbon bottle cages. And then up front, Tadej's using a Wahoo Element Bolt computer, and it's on this nice little NV out front mount that just kind of integrates it, so it's really nice in line with the stem for a nice little aero effect. So obviously Pogačar's straight off dominating the Giro, and he's everyone's hot favourite for this year's Tour, but I know what you really care about is how big those tyres are, what his cockpit measurements are, and how much this bike weighs, so let's check it out. All right, so we've got our trusty vernier calipers. As I say, these tyres look absolutely enormous, but let's see. Yeah, so 32.6 millimeters on the rear, and we'll do the front. Ooh. 33.2. I mean, those are definitely the biggest tyres that we've seen so far at this year's Tour. And obviously, I think these NVs have a really wide internal width, but I also wonder if these are actually just 30C tyres, whereas most other people are using 28s. So just measured the cockpit, and I think like last year, Pogačar's using a 130mm stem with a 36cm cockpit. That's fairly narrow. He also has his lever hoods tilted in a little bit extra. I think the distance between the lever hoods is around 31cm, so when he's really kind of tucking into that aero position, he's going to be able to get really nice and narrow and obviously really fast. So in terms of weight, we have, no, still very light, 7.27. Now last year, like I said, Tadej's bike weighed 7.245. This has a couple of little heavier bits that his number one race bike doesn't have, so I suspect his race bike is a little bit lighter still as well. Now one detail on this bike that's not easy to spot from the opposite side is this Bicone bottom bracket. Now I hadn't heard of Bicone, but I just looked them up, and they're a Spanish brand making kind of ceramic bottom brackets. Now it looks very cool, obviously it's got this little blue anodized finish, but I think the most striking thing about this is it costs 399 euros. So that's Pogačar's Colnago V4 RS, but let's check out Jonas Vingegaard. What's he riding this year? This is Jonas Vingegaard's Cervélo R5 for the 2024 Tour de France. Now it's got a brand new paint job this year, which is inspired by the Renaissance, and I'll read you the little blurb. Team Visma Lisa bike pays homage to the Renaissance with a special Tour de France paint job inspired by this remarkable period of development. The drive for innovation and progress from that era reflects the team's mission to push boundaries and strive for improvements every day, and this unique Renaissance pattern represents this mindset. So this is essentially the Michelangelo designed Tour de France bike, the Sistine Chapel of Tour de France bikes, if you will. This is the R5, but we're told Jonas will start on the S5 for the first stage like he did last year. But as with some teams, Jonas is lucky enough to have a choice between two bikes. He can choose between this lightweight climbing machine for the really mountainous stages, or the more aero S5 for the flatter and more rolling stages. Of course, they can also use the S5 with shallower wheels or the R5 with deeper wheels, just mixing and matching depending on their preferences for the day. So as you can see, the R5 is a pretty traditional looking frame with a kind of gently sloping top tube, kind of traditional seat stays, maybe one of the only bikes in the Tour de France without drop seat stays, if you can believe it. But it does have some aero details. Now the tube shapes look fairly traditional, but they're actually what Cervélo calls squoval, which kind of means square oval. It's like a kind of truncated aerofoil shape that lends the bike a little bit of aerodynamic efficiency, although obviously not to the same extent as the S5, which uses much deeper aerofoil tubes. So whereas on the S5 it has the kind of proprietary integrated cockpit with the V stem and its proprietary handlebar, Jonas Vingegaard has a Vision Metron 5D Evo handlebar on this one, which looks like it has a little bit of flare at the hoods for a slightly narrower position, and then the drops are slightly wider for a little bit more control on the descents. What's interesting to notice is that now that the team have moved on to the new SRAM Red Axis group set, Jonas Vingegaard is using the new SRAM Red Axis shifters, whereas at last year's Tour he was using the SRAM 4 style shifters rather than the kind of older and slightly bulkier SRAM Red shifters. In terms of gearing, now I think obviously this is a climbing bike and it's set up with slightly smaller gearing than what we'd probably see on his S5. It's got a 52-39 tooth chainring up front, paired with a 10 to 36 tooth cassette out the back. Now obviously 52-10, still a pretty big gear, like that's kind of roughly equivalent to like a 54 or maybe a 55-11. So it's not a small gear by any means, but obviously at the speeds of Tour de France is being raced, a bottom gear of 39-36, probably one of the smaller gears we've seen at this year's Tour de France. Jonas is running on this bike the Reserve 42-49 wheels. Now Reserve is part of the Cervélo stable, and these rims are really, really wide. They've got a 25mm internal width. And one thing we've just spotted, is I haven't seen this before, this is the first time I've ever seen this, is Vittoria has got some Corsa Pro TLRs in a 29C, and it says they're specifically designed for 25mm wide rims. Now you might remember earlier on in this year, there were a kind of couple of hiccups with hookless rims and 28C tyres. And basically there was a bit of a discrepancy between what the kind of ETRTO was recommending and what the ISO was recommending, and that some teams had previously, or some wheel manufacturers had previously said that it was fine to run 28C tyres on 25mm wide rims, but then the kind of ETRTO and ISO updated their standards and said, no, you can't, you should only run a 29. And after the whole kind of Thomas de Gent hookless blow-off incident, which was kind of really unrelated to that whole hookless thing, it was kind of later determined that he'd hit an object, broken the rim, and that even if it would have been hooked rims, the tyre still would have probably come off the rim. But it looks like Vittoria have updated their tyres to offer a 29C, because it's likely that a lot of these wheel manufacturers were designing their rims around 28C tyres from a kind of aerodynamics perspective. And so updating to a 29C rather than having to run a 30C probably just brings a little bit of aerodynamic benefit. Now in terms of the little details, Jonas is running a Physique Antares carbon saddle like he was last year. He's also running the Wahoo Speedplay aero pedals, which have the little golf ball dimples on the underside. I've seen a lot of the Jumbo-Visma riders riding those. Obviously it's not a huge aero gain, but it's a kind of marginal thing, and I guess every little helps. And it also looks like they're running a wax chain, and we don't see too many of those in the pro peloton because, and they might be a little bit faster, they're a little bit tricky because when the mechanics are jet washing the bikes at the end of every stage, that wax comes off really easy, and it takes a little bit longer to take the chain off and re-wax it. So you have to be kind of careful. So we don't see many teams running that, but I guess when you're a Tour de France yellow jersey contender, you can ask to have every last little bit of extra help. So this bike is set up 2x. At the start of last year's tour, we did see Jonas with a 1x crankset on his Aero S5. Now, with SRAM has kind of embraced 1x for road bikes much more warmly than Shimano has, and we expect a lot of the SRAM sponsored riders, including Jonas, to basically switch between 1x and 2x depending on the kind of stage parcours and their preferences. I imagine, for example, the first time trial, which is very, very flat, all of the SRAM sponsored riders will be on aero chain rings with a 1x setup, and kind of the front derailleur, they'll just take it off and maybe run a chain guide just to get that little bit of extra aero benefit. One more little detail I've noticed is that there's a little sticker over the crank bolt hole on this SRAM crank. I'm not entirely sure why that is. Either they're hiding maybe a non-sponsor correct bolt for that crank, or maybe it's just that last little extra aero gain. But that's his bike. Let's get on and measure those tyres, see how wide they actually measure up when they're on the rims, and we can measure his cockpit setup and of course give you that all-important weight figure. Okay, let's see how wide these 29Cs measure up on the rims. So it looks like Jonas is running a 120mm stem with a 38cm handlebar. That's the same as he was running last year. And just like with the crank, I've also noticed that he's just got a little sticker over his stem top cap bolt as well. Again, probably just a little aero gain. All right, let's get this thing on the scales. Ooh, 6.74, which is under the UCI's weight limit of 6.8. Let's hope computers count towards the UCI weight limit. So I'm sure you've all got your opinions on who's going to win the Tour de France, but what about the real competition? Who has the best bike? Let us know in the comments below whether you preferred Jonas Vingegaard's Cervélo R5 or Tadej Pogačar's Colnago V4 RS. And as always, don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to our channel if you want to see more videos like this. And if you do want to see more videos like this, why not watch this one?